So last but not the least, we have Melissa Vergara-Fernandez. So thank you very much, Melissa, for being here today. It's a pleasure to meet you in person at last. And Melissa will talk about what make asset pricing research empirically successful. So I'll leave the floor to you, Melissa. Thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you, Emiliano, for the invitation. It's really great to be here. It's very refreshing, I think, to be able to talk about philosophy and finance with people that and in a in a setting that is just for philosophy or finance. That's very precious. So thank you very much for bringing us here today. All right, so let me say something about this paper and in general the project that I am involved in. So I started almost 2.5 years ago, a postdoc at Erasmus University that is financed by an initiative at the university called Dynamics of Inclusive Prosperity. I'm working with another philosopher, Konrad Hellman, and financial economist, Marta Szymanowska. And we have been kind of trying to, or doing philosophy of science of finance. And I think that the work, or at least how I would characterize the work that we have so far been doing, is trying to let sort of the groundwork for financial economics, or at least understand the historical development of the field, and trying to understand how these models are somehow related to each other in a historical dimension. We have also done some work on performativity, well, for me personally, this is sort of a new thing, because when I started this postdoc, I knew very little about finance. So I think that I would describe this paper that I'm going to present here today as sort of my attempt to, after 2.5 years of trying to make sense of finance, how does this sort of relate to economics, or how can we put it together? And I think I found an interesting framework for sort of characterizing this, and that is related basically, I don't know how to let me do like this. Yeah. Related to what has been described in economics as the empirical turn. So this is something that has been characterized by a few people. It started with Hammermesh, a paper that where he tried to make sense of how economics had somehow turned from being very theoretical to changing into much more empirical science. So what he did was he took 748 articles from the top 3 journals, AAR, JB, QGE, published in 1 year during 6 decades. So he took 1963, 73, 83, and so forth, and tried to figure out how the discipline had somehow changed. So this is what I'm interested in showing you here is how in 63 theory was extremely prevalent, and how that towards 2011 had moved to 19% of the work. At the same time, we see how empirical, he makes here the distinction between borrowed data, so data that is already available, and researchers working with their own data, and how this here basically had a massive impact, or a massive increase, sorry, in those 6 decades, and the same for experimental work. So basically the idea here is there was an empirical turn in economics, and this work was later, let's say, well, improved or expanded by Angrist and others, where they use machine learning to analyze and classify 134,000 and 892 articles from 80 journals between 1980 and 2015. So basically they trained an algorithm to try to classify the work of how it was done along this period of time. And basically here they suggest, okay, the shift consists of changing research style within fields rather than across fields. Is more or less the suggestion they make. So they do a certain number of they also look at co-authors and so forth. But what I'm interested in showing you here is they do, of course, a more parsed analysis. And we can see here how basically the microeconomic work, which is say the mostly as a fraction of is say the least empirical, whereas we have things like development and international economics, that are very empirical, and that basically still there was a trend, an increasing trend of becoming more and more empirical. They make this distinction between micro labor, miscellaneous is basically everything that was not considered, then macro finance, public finance, industrial organization, international economics, and development. I think an important thing to note here about finance is that while they talk about finance, they don't include any of the big journals in finance. So this is kind of important to note. And here is another figure, the weighted publications by style, where what they did actually is somehow first classify something as econometrics, and then whatever is not considered econometrics, they say it's either theoretical. I mean, the algorithm is either theoretical or empirical. And we see here again, you know, a big trend towards more empirical work in a larger pool of papers, and at the same time just divided by the different fields. So this somehow gives a little bit more detailed story of what Hammermesh tried to do in 2013. All right, so okay. And so this is somehow what we see the sort of the evidence, right? We see economics becoming more empirical. And now here we have a work of Backhouse and Cherrier, who try to put a little bit of explanation, or as historians, they try to make sense of, okay, what drove this change in economics? And they also examine not only what drove this change in economics, but they also try to find evidence of this turn through the citations of the John Bates Clark medalists. So what they say here, or the reason why they use the John Bates Clark medalist, is because this is a prize that is granted to economists under 40. So they say, okay, this might track also, the new comers or the young people into the discipline, maybe more than Nobel laureates who have kind of a track record. So this is a good maybe indication of the work that is being done in economics. And on the basis of the citations of the John Bates Clark medalists, they say, okay, there was an increased prominence of empirical work. So they suggest sort of a nuance in the sense that they say it's not necessarily that there was more work, empirical work being done, but it's a matter of the prominence of the work, or the importance attributed to the work, to the empirical work increased. So yeah, maybe this empirical term is not the right description for what they're trying to say. But okay, so they cite potential factors that could have caused this shift. And some of them that they cite are the challenge of relevance in the 70s. So basically this is coming from, say, an urge to respond to the challenges of the 70s, the Vietnam War, the oil prices, and so forth. Another important aspect is the rise of data and computerization and the increased importance of non-academic institutions. It is worthwhile noting that that these days they talk about them as merely potential factors that could have helped this, but they are of course not trying to provide like a explanation of this being really the factors. These are just suggestions that they make, and in fact their paper is also very much programmatic. This was part of a Hope conference that took place at Duke, and they basically invite contributions to try to understand this change in the profession. So this is kind of their work. And so what I'm going to do here, or at least what I think is interesting to do, is I would like to compare or try to see the development of financial economics in light of this empirical turn that has been made in economics. So, and I would like to, or at least I will refer in particular to asset pricing, and to compare them basically to understand, okay, are there analogies or disanalogies here? I think there are both analogies and disanalogies between the general story of economics and the field of finance. And I would like to suggest, and this is maybe a part that is not super, or at least is not yet developing my paper, but I think I would like to make that claim, and is that because of the way in which financial economics has developed, it might actually be kind of a successful empirical enterprise. The reason, or at least the motivation that I have for this is, of course, the empirical turn in economics has been seen with very good eyes. We have the Nobel laureates recently also for their empirical work in economics becoming more real world, more down to earth. And so in this sense, I would like to maybe also make the connection, okay, if financial economics has been empirical, which is somehow what I'm going to say later, then this is somehow a measure of success for empirical finance, or sorry, for financial economics as a subdiscipline of economics. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do now. And I will compare what Backhaus and Charrier say, and will comment or make points about how financial economics has developed to suggest that that there are analogies and disanalogies between the general story and field of finance. So this is the account of Backhaus and Charrier, and they basically characterize economics between the Second World War and the 90s as there being a hierarchy in which theory was at the top. So theory was what you had to do. And important illustrations of this, there are many more, but important illustrations are the measurement without theory that basically everyone knows about, between Charlene Koopmans and Jacob Vining on the work of Burns and Mitchell at the MBER on business cycles, right? So this was basically a debate in which Koopmans and the people from the Cowles Commission were saying your work is, you cannot do measurement without theory. And there was this need, or this idea that theory has to come first in order to be able to start thinking and characterizing business cycles. They also cite they discuss, not in depth, but briefly, something that is very interesting, and that is that at some point, I think the end of the 40s, there was some discussion at the American Economic Association over the curriculum in economics, and they cite that they say that 98% of the professors thought that theory was essential, whereas only 53% thought that statistics was essential, 55% thought that economic history was essential. And there is
1940s.
Yeah, the end of 1940s, yes. And there is this quote that says, economic departments should not convert into trade schools. And I think this is also very telling, because at that time, it is exactly when business schools were trying to become more serious, more rigorous, more scientific. So there is a clear kind of the same aim from both sides. Business schools trying to become rigorous and scientific, and economists just giving this prevalent role to theory and not thinking that that they should not convert into trade schools. And in the story that Backhaus and Cherrier tell, I think that it could be said that they kind of suggest that there's a linear shift towards applied work. So that first there was this, this hierarchy of theory, and that kind of changed into more applied work. Okay, so let me now say a little bit more about financial economics in the same period. So financial economics between World War II and 1970s, and here is an analogy. So of course there was significant theoretical work. We have, of course, portfolio selection, Markowitz, Tobin, and the CAPM with the usual, the known suspects. So of course, this is the theoretical core and background of financial economics at that time. But at the same time, there was lots of empirical and applied work. So one of the things or a few things that I would like to highlight here is the creation of CRISP, the Center for Research in Security Prices in 1960s, which is allegedly the first systematic collection of security prices. I mean, of course, there is work before by Bachelier and other people, and Cowles himself, and working is also another one where there was some kind of niches of data collection for a particular exercise, but the creation of CRISP at the University of Chicago was really the an institutional and a kind of directed attempt to really start capturing and collecting and analyzing security prices. And here we can say also that the analysis of stock prices by Cowles, by Kuttner, by Fama is what led to the efficient market hypothesis, in the sense that this was a primarily empirical exercise. I mean, the relation, I think, to equilibrium in economics is coming at a later stage, but this was primarily an empirical endeavor and the result of empirical work. There's something also important here is the simplification of portfolio theory for actual portfolio selection. So we have here the work of Sharp in 1963, where he tries to simplify the work of Markowitz and to say, if we want to have some use this, Markowitz is great, but it's undoable in a sense. So if we want to do this in a practicable way, we need to come up with a working model, and this is where he tried to basically come up with this single risk factor and to see whether there's something that can be used in practice. And then there's, so what I would say from this is that this somehow shows that parallel development of theoretical work, there was this parallel development of theoretical and empirical work, and this was a constant interplay, right? So in contrast, say, so what I would like to highlight here is, yes, there's an important theoretical component here of the CAPM, and portfolio selection, but at the same time, there's a lot going on in terms of empirical work. And that is somehow disanalogous, so to say, or I would like to claim, at least when it comes to how important this was for the discipline with economics, right? So the relevance of empirical work here is just very high. Okay, so now we move again back to Backhaus and Cherrier in the way in which they characterize economics after 1970. So here they say, okay, this privileged position that theory had was challenged, and that is shown by these Clark-Medley citations, which increasingly highlighted the significance of basically two new ways of applying theory. So they suggest that these two ways of applying theory are one, application of a common core to different problems. Some of these problems are, for instance, Krugman on imperfect competition and its impact on international trade, Hegman on panel data, Card on natural experiments and its effect on labor economics. And the other way in which theory is being applied is the thinking that theories had policy relevance. So an example here is Raj Shetty on tax and education policy and social insurance. So the idea is, okay, economists started thinking that their work had actually, that they were, the theories were in a, the theoretical development was such that they were in a position to actually make policy recommendations. So this is, again, the characterization that Backhaus and Cherrier make of economics after 1970. And then let me now turn to, say, financial economics after 1970. And here I would like to say again, okay, it engaged in a massive program of theory testing and confrontation with the data. So we have, as of the models, as of the beginning of the the building of the CAPM in 1964, the first serious tests that were done started in 1973. And from then onwards, we have very important work that is testing the CAPM with positive and negative results. Yeah, the first is Fama and Macbeth, I think, 1973, and with somehow kind of positive result in the sense that the linear relationship holds, but for some particular, the low beta and the high beta assets were not quite as the model predicted. And we could say here, at least from what I understand, is that from this testing that came of the CAPM model, the Fama French contribution is three-factor and five-factor model, which in turn later developed all the factor models that are well, basically atheoretical to some extent, because they're just simply trying to find out factors that will yield higher expected returns. And with respect to this point that Backhaus and Cherrier make when it comes to being able to make policy recommendations, I think that financial economists already before 1970 thought or were in positions to be normative or to have policy influence. So here, important examples are Jensen, Trainer, and Sharp, the ratios that are used as measures to evaluate investment performance of mutual funds. These were measures of investment that were used at the hearings by the SCE, to introduce regulation on fees charged by asset managers. There was a very interesting report written in 1978 by Chicago scholars well, by Chicago scholars under somehow the invitation or the commission of Wells Fargo for the Bank Administration Institute, basically to recommend what was the adequate assessment of investment performance of pension funds. So these are academic scholars, but also Jack Traynor was sort of in both sides. But we see here these scholars being very much involved in policy recommendations and having actually practical, being of practical consequence. Okay, so potential explanations. So Backhouse and Cherrier, they say, okay, what are potential explanations? And one of them that they cite is computerization. And this is somehow undeniable role of the effects that the computer had on the way economics was done. So here they cite the simplex method for solving linear problems. The suggestion is that the numerical method was used, but software packages were still unreliable and didn't produce the same results. There was a constant interaction between progress in computing and development of new econometric techniques. And there is development of technology facilitated the development of new sources of data as well as larger data sets. So I think, well, this is somehow what they say is crucial computerization for economics. I think that this is something that is definitely shared between economics and financial economics. And I would like to say, I don't know to what extent this is different, but I think it's interesting that computerization itself, but also its limits shaped the field. So again, the first example that I want to highlight here is, of course, the creation of CRISP in 1960s. The simplification of Markowitz portfolio theory driven by computation limitations is exactly the exercise that Sharp 63 was trying to address, right? So if we do Markowitz, is just impossible given the computer power that we have right now. So how can we write a kind of a computer program that would allow us to find the correlations between different assets? And the computerization is actually something that encouraged quantification in financial economics and initiatives such as the Wells Fargo Management Sciences Division. So I think there's a very interesting story here of how John McQuon, who was an engineer from, I think he's from Harvard, he was hired at Wells Fargo, basically because he was at some point trying to crunch some numbers in order to see whether he could sort of make money, find patterns in the data or in stock price data. And he was renting an IBM computer somewhere at very high cost, so he would do it at the weekends. And at some point, the people from IBM, from whom he was, well, he was hiring this IBM computer, contacted him and said whether he would be willing to go and talk at a conference about the possibilities that a computer had for the work that he was doing. And at that conference was Ransom Cook, who was the chairman of Wells Fargo. And he thought, okay, this is going to solve my problem, or this is a great opportunity for some of the problems that we have here at Wells Fargo. And basically, the guy hired McQuon, gave him, I think, $1 million to start the Management Sciences Division, basically with the task of using the computer for solving some of the problems that Wells. Sorry?
In the 60s. What year? Remember?
This is 1964.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is again, I think if you look at how this Management Sciences Division had an impact as well on the creation of index funds, then you can also kind of tell a much bigger story of the impact of
It's amazing. This put you do computer in 1964, right? It is,
Yeah.
Yeah. No, basically nothing.
it's super fascinating. Super fascinating.
Okay, so what I think is interesting here is that yes, the computer basically gave impetus to the discipline, but at the same time, the fact that there were limitations also made people do certain things. And I think the best example is Sharp in just, okay, how do we solve this problem? And from there, you could say that the CAPM, the single factor model, kind of came up. Okay, another very interesting aspect that Backhaus and Cherrier discuss is the increased importance of non-academic institutions for fostering empirical work. So they say, well, it has become more common for economists to be associated to non-academic institutions. And here they cite the IMF, the Bank of International Settlements, United Nations, etc. And these organizations have a large body of economists, particularly in fields that are underrepresented in economics, so development, international, monetary economics. They also cite or mention the transformation of the think tank landscape, and in particular, the rise of the advocacy think tanks, which are think tanks that have a particular kind of political goal in mind. And they cite as well the proliferation of specialized journals. So these were all things that might have given impetus to the work of to empirical work. And I think here the non-academic institutions in financial economics is also great. One of them is Merrill Lynch, which partnered with the University of Chicago to sponsor the creation of CRISP. So this is also, I think, really a fascinating story because they started as a sort of an advertisement thing that Merrill Lynch wanted to do. So at some point they wanted to attract. This is an advertisement that appeared. I think it's the New York Times. Where basically they explain what the stock and bond business is about. This is Merrill Lynch. And this is the work of a guy called Louis Engel, who was hired at the advertisement department in order to try to basically make business for Merrill Lynch. And the guy came with the idea that a good way of attracting business for Merrill Lynch was basically to explain to people what their business was about. And here we have to think, this is again the 1960s. People, of course, still have the Great Depression in their mind. They are afraid of investing in stock. So the strategy of Merrill Lynch was to start educating people. At some point, this guy in the advertisement department, he wanted to basically be able to tell people what were the differences in returns between investing in the stock market than in other assets. And it turned out that basically nobody knew. So people from Merrill Lynch, they called James Lowry at the University of Chicago, and they say, well, we don't know the answer, but why don't you give us some money to finance this endeavor? And they did. And that is how CRISP was created. So Merrill Lynch contributed, I think, something like $50,000 for a period of 6 months. And ultimately, it became a 3-year endeavor with 200,000 euros additional, dollars. And this is what, brought out CRISP, and so here we have, basically a bank that is giving the meat for financial specialists to basically do their work. Another example is Wells Fargo, which is one of the oldest banks in the USA, initiated the management sciences division that I already mentioned. with the purpose of developing quantitative methods for money management. I mentioned this already. And yeah, I also mentioned this from this division, emerged the idea of index funds, which changed the modus operandi of the investment industry. And another example is Arthur D. Little, which is a consultancy on operations research, brought its research in close contact with academia to the asset management industry. So here, well, an important figure here is Jack Traynor, who worked at Fisher Black. They worked there at ADL. And they, again, also had a very important influence in the asset management industry. The asset management industry basically hired at some point Arthur D. Little to argue against regulation for the fees that they were changing. And in the end, it turned out that basically that the research that Arthur D. Little did was not very not convenient for, the results were not convenient for the asset management industry. But so this is again a way in which non-academic institutions have shaped financial economics. So okay, yeah. So basically, to wrap up, I think that there are certainly some analogies with economics so financial economics has some analogies with economics, but important disanalogies. So I would say the analogy is an important theoretical core. The CAPM, I think, has been crucial or very significant in how the field developed. But there are also important disanalogies in, I would say, financial economics being just very much driven by empirical work, and somehow also in maybe being pioneer or anticipating economics in the way in which it interacted with the practice. So there was, I think, no apparent hierarchy between theory and empirical application. I would say rather there's a back and forth between theory and empirical applications. This is also something that we do in another work that hopefully will be published soon. And the role of non-academic institutions as well as computerization did not change the style, but actually shaped the discipline. So I think this is, yeah, I would say rather this analogy. Okay, yeah, I've reached the end of my talk, and I would say, okay, the conclusions, or at least what I think is interesting to highlight here, is that if this analysis is correct, the insight about finance and finance research is helpful to understand the idiosyncrasies of the field. So in a sense, this might lead us to think that the work, for instance, that Angrist did of looking at fields, it might be worthwhile also looking into very specific fields and not just economics as a whole. And I think this may call for less all-encompassing statements about the state of economics and basically to make more field-specific assessments within economics. And something else is, okay, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. And if it turns out that financial economics can claim some empirical success, which I really haven't argued for, right? I haven't said to what extent asset pricing really gives, you know, I think there are good reasons there, but I haven't touched this, so I'm not going to commit to this. The fact that it has been developed in check with empirical reality might be what we could call the successful model of scientific development. Yeah, this is, I think, but I think it's the best I can claim with this work. But I think there are, as I again, might be interesting things that we can maybe highlight of whether asset pricing is indeed a empirical, successful discipline in the most interesting way, let's say, and not the philosophy of science kind of way. Yeah, that's it. So thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Melissa, for this very interesting talk. And we can now open the debate and to see if there are questions coming from the audience here in the room. Also, if on the online people, if someone wants to speak, just raise your hand. So we have a question coming from Bodewin.
Something in the chat that I see.
Yeah, but there is no hands. So we have Bodewin, yeah.
I think it's a really lovely paper. I learned a lot of interesting philosophy things, but also fun things about the development of finance. So it's really very enjoyable. I have a really very detailed question. There's lots of other things, but I was wondering if. So I'm thinking about this claim that you introduced that policy relevance actually drove the empirical, or was at least part of the drive or the development to more empirical research in economics, maybe also finance. And I wonder if that is, yeah, it's a bit harsh to say whether it's true, whether that's true, but whether it's conditional on other things happening as well, because I do think that also highly theoretical work in for instance game theory had policy relevance right after the Second World War, as it was used by policymakers involved in Cold War strategy. And that was extremely theoretical, but it was widely published. The work by Thomas Schelling, in particular, in international relations, has been extremely influential in academic circles, but also in policy circles. So I wonder if it is really the policy that drove the development to more empirical research, or whether it is the fact that empirical methods became available, which allowed the policy applications to spread to domains in which a purely theoretical approach wasn't available, right? So I think there's a difference of causality here.
Mm-hmm.
Or do you think that maybe the episode in the history of game theory is just an outlier, the exception that proves to rule?
Okay. Yeah. Thank you for that question. So I think you have highlighted something very important. So let me first clarify. So I think what Backhaus and Cherrier say is, it's not, they don't say policy drove the need for empirical work. They say at some point the economists thought they were in a position to make policy recommendations, that maybe this is something that was not done before. And in the second way in which they thought that theory was more applied was the need to address this kind of world issues, the oil crisis and so forth. But I think you have highlighted something very important, and it's that it's something that we cannot deny, and it's in fact the war effort, right? So the Rand Corporation, for instance, is right, designed to solve practical problems, and where theoretical things, where theory came basically just to solve a particular issue. So I think that would somehow reinforce my first conclusion that maybe this all-encompassing histories of economics as a whole might not necessarily be the most informative. and that might require then more work into specific fields, right? In this case, I think what is interesting is, or at least what I would like to claim is, some people like Donald McKenzie and other sociologists have done amazing work in the development of financial economics, also the work of Perry Merling. But this relation, at least what I haven't so far found, is this relation of financial economics vis-a-vis economics. And I think this is interesting, and yeah, and you could say, okay, what is then economics, right? But anyway, I think what is something that I find really fascinating, this is kind of a parenthesis, but it might be also a bit telling. I presented some work on finance at the history conference, the Latin American Society for History of Economic Thought. I presented something on finance, and some people, one of the comments that I got was that they were kind of pleased to see that I was doing somehow multidisciplinary work, in the sense that what they were somehow suggesting is that they didn't think that financial economics was economics at all. And I think this is interesting because there is, at least to my mind, there is very little shared, or there is very little history of these two things. We have, of course, some things like the Cowles Commission and how it had some effects, or it led to some things going on in finance. But sort of as a field, I don't think there is this work. And I would say that, given your comment, that might suggest that for financial economics, the same holds for game theory, experimental economics, what have you, industrial organization, or things like that. So maybe we just have to be less ambitious, maybe, in the histories that we write about the field. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for that paper. That was just really fascinating to listen to. There are all these little connections, the kind of history I was talking about today. This isn't my question, but just as a quick note, John McCohen.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't know. This is,
yeah. He actually hired Oldřich Vazicek and brought him from Czechoslovakia. Yeah, so it's very interesting. But I guess so. My question, if I understand, your argument, what you're kind of pointing to is this idea that financial economics, when applied first, it sort of led the rest of economics, and you point to these kind of it's growing interaction with non-academic institutions, the growth of data. And one thing I found myself thinking about is a comment that a number of my interviewees made, which is, there seems to be this kind of repeated pattern where, in my data at least, people had a lot of difficulty publishing, a new model that really didn't conform to regular academic practice, but they were able to kind of draw on the popularity of this model, among practitioners, to sort of nudge the editor and say, actually, this is really widely used, this is why it's kind of, it should be published. And I guess one of the things I was wondering is so when, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the person who did all the testing of market efficiency, Fama, when Fama and these other financial economists were doing this highly empirical work, do you get a sense that, that kind of highly applied orientation was being looked down on by regular economists who were still very much in this kind of theoretical mentality? And I guess one of the things that I'm very curious about is how they balance legitimizing their activities with respect to the rest of the discipline. or perhaps finance was separate enough that they really didn't need to do that. I'm not really sure. I mean, Larry Summers has this whole, he had this paper on catch-up economics, kind of dismissing finance. So maybe at that point they were quite separate, but it would be quite interesting if, you know, you could kind of draw out that problem of legitimating what you're doing to the rest of the field when you are doing something quite novel. Yeah, so if you have kind of a response to that, that would be great. But yeah, just more of a comment, I guess. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. Yeah, indeed. Well, this is, so with respect to the publishing papers, I think this is also what I find so interesting about the work that some historians of economics have been doing in, you know, this external history of trying to look at these things, the effect of conferences and so forth, and not just, you know, relying on theory and ideas. So this is something that would have to be looked at. I know there is a paper indeed that there were some phone calls that had to be made for people to actually publish it, but I don't know which one it was, so I don't want to say much. Yeah, so that's about that. I think that would be kind of interesting work to do of how, yeah, financial economists at that time were kind of navigating in a journal-based the field or the discipline. They did publish, of course, in Econometrica. Also, if you look at, I mean, Econometrica was born basically thanks to Coles. And anyway, so the first paper I think that was published in Econometrica was by Alfred Coles on stock prices. But anyway, it's I think something very interesting to look into, and I don't know about this balance or the legitimizing the activities with the rest of the field. I think that's, I would say, maybe hard to disentangle, because for some interesting reason this research took place at extremely privileged or universities, right? So here we're talking about the University of Chicago, the MIT, which were not some community college somewhere, right? And I think that matters, right? That's important. So maybe, you know, people at the University of Chicago, they were simply in a position, the business school, they were simply in a position to just not care. There's this story of Markowitz. He got his PhD at Chicago, and Milton Friedman was in his committee, and at some point Milton Friedman said, well, I don't know if we can give you a PhD in economics, because this is not economics what you're doing here. Yeah, so, but anyway, it's the University of Chicago and the business school. So I know that I think Ross Emmett has done a lot of work in Chicago, the University of Chicago. So that is something that I don't know about, and would be interesting to see the sort of the interplay between the Chicago Business School and the faculty or the Faculty of Economics, how that was, how that relationship was. Yeah.
I guess it is interesting to know that a lot of this research is just taking place in the business school already.
Yeah.
Because I guess I wasn't sure if like financial economics really started in economics and then moved outside, but it sounds like it was happening in quite a different institutional setting from the get-go. You know, so maybe they didn't face the same pressures, like a little bit more flat.
Yeah, well, you have, I think, three. So Carnegie Mellon was with Modigliani and Miller. They were the MIT when Modigliani moved to, well, Modigliani is a macroeconomist, but he moved to the MIT and Chicago. But yeah, no, I mean, this is work that needs to be done. So. Yeah.
There are no other questions. Maybe we can close here the conference, and thank you again, Melissa.
Thanks to you, Emiliano,
Yes.
for